When word got out that Florida wildlife officials were turning loose hundreds of predatory snakes on purpose, the internet did what the internet always does. It laughed. Comment sections filled with jokes about a state that already couldn't control the snakes it had. Late-night hosts found an easy punchline. Somewhere in Florida, they joked, a bureaucrat had looked at a swamp full of 40-foot serpents devouring everything that moved and said, "You know what this needs? More snakes." But strip away the punchlines, and you find a story that isn't about recklessness at all. It's about a 20-year ecological collapse so severe that scientists eventually admitted total victory was impossible, and about one native predator that Florida had almost let go extinct decades earlier, now being asked to do a job humans, drones, and dogs couldn't finish. To understand why anyone would fight snakes with snakes, you first have to understand exactly how bad things had gotten. The Everglades isn't just a swamp. It's a slow-moving river of grass, roughly 1.5 million acres of wetland that filters drinking water from millions of Floridians, absorbs storm surge, and support a web of wildlife found nowhere else on the continent. Economists have valued the ecosystem services it provides at tens of billions of dollars a year. For most of the 20th century, it functioned the way a healthy wilderness should. Predators and prey locked in a balance that had been tuned by millions of years of evolution. That balance started breaking in the early 1990s, though almost nobody noticed at the time. Burmese pythons, native to the swamps and grasslands of Southeast Asia, had become popular in the American exotic pet trade. They were cheap, dramatic-looking, and, as hatchlings, easy to manage. The problem is that Burmese pythons don't stay small. A python that starts life short enough to coil in a shoebox can top 15 feet and outweigh its owner within a few years. Predictably, some owners panicked and released their snakes into nearby canals and marshland, telling themselves they were doing the animal a kindness. Then, in August 1992, Hurricane Andrew tore across South Florida with 165 miles per hour winds, and among the buildings it flattened were reptile breeding and import facilities near Miami. Cages broke open. An unknown number of pythons simply walked, or slithered, out into the wetlands, joining the snakes already loose by pet owners. Florida's climate turned out to be almost a perfect match for the species' native range. Hot, humid, full of prey, and lacking any predator large enough or experienced enough to recognize an adult Burmese python as food. For years, the growing population stayed mostly invisible, camouflaged in sawgrass and hammock brush. But invisibility didn't mean inactivity. Female pythons can produce clutches approaching 100 eggs at a time, and with no disease, no competition, and no real predation pressure, survival rates for those hatchlings were far higher than anything the species experiences in its native range. By the time researchers began seriously tracking the problem, the population had already exploded beyond any hope of a quick fix. Current estimates from the U.S. Geological Survey and Florida wildlife agencies placed the python population anywhere from the tens of thousands into the hundreds of thousands, spread across the southern third of the state. The damage showed up first in mammal survey data, and it was staggering. Researchers with the U.S. Geological Survey, comparing road survey sightings before and after the python boom, documented raccoon and opossum populations collapsing by well over 90% in the areas most heavily colonized by pythons, with bobcat sightings down by more than 80% in marsh rabbits, and foxes effectively disappearing from python-heavy survey routes altogether. Deer, once a common sight along Everglades roadways at dusk, became rare. This wasn't a slow decline. It was closer to a local extinction event, and it was happening in one of the most celebrated ecosystems in North America. What made it worse was the sheer range of what pythons would eat. Necropsies on captured snakes have turned up alligators, full-grown white-tailed deer swallowed whole, wading birds, and even other pythons. Wildlife biologist Ian Bertashek of the Conservancy of Southwest Florida has noted that after more than a decade of studying the species, it's easier to list what pythons haven't been found eating than what they have. An ecosystem that had absorbed hurricanes, droughts, and human development for centuries was being hollowed out from the inside by an animal most Floridians had never even seen in the wild. Florida did not sit still. What followed was one of the more expensive and inventive wildlife control campaigns in American history, and nearly all of it fell short. The most famous effort is the Florida Python Challenge, an annual public hunt launched in 2013 that invites civilians to head into the Everglades and remove as many pythons as they can find, with cash prizes for the largest snakes and the biggest hauls. It generates headlines every summer, and it has genuinely helped raise public awareness of the crisis. But the numbers tell a more sobering story. In the 2025 competition, the event's top hunter brought in roughly 60 snakes, a personal and event record, while all participants combined removed under 300 pythons total. Against a population that may run into six figures, that's a rounding error. Behind the scenes, Florida also built a professional removal program. The South Florida Water Management District and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission both employ contracted hunters who work the swamps essentially year-round, paid by the hour and by the foot of snake removed. Since that program's inception in 2017, contracted hunters and researchers have pulled more than 23,000 pythons out of South Florida, an enormous number of individual removals, and, according to biologists running the program, still likely less than 1% of the total population. Technology was the next front. Florida wildlife agencies and university researchers have experimented with thermal sensing robotic prey designed to lure pythons into detectable strikes, trained detector dogs capable of picking up python scent trails, and drone surveys attempting to spot snakes from above in terrain where a 15-foot animal can vanish completely within a few feet of grass. The single most effective tool to emerge from all this research has been the scout snake, method pioneered by the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, fitting male pythons with radio transmitters and tracking them during breeding season, when instinct drives them straight to reproductive females, who are then humanely removed before they can lay their eggs. It's a clever exploitation of python biology, and it has measurably increased removal efficiency. It has not come close to solving the underlying problem. By the early 2020s, wildlife officials were saying publicly what field biologists had believed privately for years. Complete eradication of Burmese pythons from the Everglades is not a realistic goal. The species is too well established, too well camouflaged, and too fertile. The best realistic outcome, researchers concluded, was long-term suppression. Keeping numbers low enough that native wildlife has some room to recover, rather than eliminating the invader outright. That is a profoundly frustrating thing for a state to admit after spending millions of dollars and thousands of hours of labor. It's also the moment that set up everything that came next. While pythons dominated headlines, a second and far less visible threat had been riding in on their backs the entire time. Pythons imported from Southeast Asia carried a lung parasite called Rayleighdella orientalis, a pentastamid, technically closer to a crustacean than a true worm, though it's commonly called a snake lungworm. Once established in Florida's python population, the parasite found an open door into the native food web. Python droppings release the parasite's eggs into the environment. Cockroaches and other invertebrates ingest them. Frogs and lizards eat the infected insects, and native snakes that prey on those smaller animals pick up the larvae without any obvious warning sign. Inside a native snake, the larvae migrate into the lungs, where they mature and feed on blood and tissue. For smaller native species in particular, infection can be severe. Labored breathing, pneumonia, visible lung lesions, and in advanced cases, outright respiratory failure. Researchers with the University of Florida and the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission have documented the parasite in numerous native snake species, and its range has expanded well beyond South Florida into the central and northern parts of the state. Unlike the python itself, the lungworm doesn't need a python host to keep spreading. It can now move independently through native snake populations, which means removing every python in Florida tomorrow would not make it disappear. That's an uncuffable footnote to the python story, because it means the ecological damage isn't limited to what one invasive predator eats. It's also about what that predator brought with it. A second, quieter crisis layered on top of the first, hitting the very native snakes that might otherwise help hold the ecosystem together. Against that backdrop, a predator that can't be eradicated and a parasite that can't be cured, Florida wildlife officials announced a plan to release native, non-venomous Eastern Indigo snakes back into parts of the state's wildland. The internet's reaction was immediate and largely the same joke repeated in 1,000 variations. Florida already has a snake problem, and the fix is more snakes? Comparisons to famously botched biological control efforts, like the mongooses introduced to Hawaii and the Caribbean in the 1800s, which failed to control rats and instead devastated native birds, circulated widely to a public exhausted by python headlines. It looked like one more example of a state making an already strange situation stranger. What most of that commentary missed is that the Eastern Indigo Snake reintroduction wasn't a python crisis fix cooked up on the fly. It was, and is, a decades-old conservation program with a completely different origin story, one that happens to overlap usefully with the fight against pythons. The Eastern Indigo Snake, dry marching couperi, is North America's longest native snake, capable of reaching 8 to 9 feet, glossy blue-black in color, and entirely non-venomous to humans. It's also a true generalist predator. It eats rodents, birds, frogs, lizards, and other snakes, including venomous species like rattlesnakes and cottonmouths, to which it has a documented resistance. Historically, it ranged across the longleaf pine forests of the southeast, from Florida through Georgia, Alabama, and into Mississippi, covering an estimated 90 million acres. That range collapsed over the 20th century for reasons that had nothing to do with pythons. Logging and agriculture destroyed the vast majority of longleaf pine habitat the species depended on. By some estimates, over 97% of it. The snake was also heavily collected for the pet trade and killed incidentally during rattlesnake roundups, when hunters pumped gasoline fumes into gopher tortoise burrows to flush out rattlesnakes, a practice that also drove out and killed indigo snakes sheltering in the same burrows. By 1978, the U.S. government listed the Eastern Indigo Snake as a federally threatened species. In parts of its former range, including much of the Florida Panhandle, it had disappeared entirely. The last confirmed sighting at one key North Florida site dated back to 1982. The recovery effort now underway traces back to 2017, when the Nature Conservancy, the Central Florida Zoo and Botanical Gardens, Orianne Center for Indigo Conservation, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service began a coordinated captive breeding and release program centered on the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, a nearly 6,500-acre property that had undergone decades of longleaf pine and gopher tortoise habitat restoration specifically to make it suitable for the snake's return. Hatchlings are bred at the Orianne Center, raised for roughly a year, transferred to the Welaka National Fish Hatchery for a second-year growth, and finally released as 2-year-old snakes into restored sandhill habitat. That's the part the online jokes never mentioned. This was an emergency response to pythons. It was a patient, methodical, science-driven restoration project that happened to be gaining momentum at the same moment the python crisis was dominating headlines, and it targets a completely different, and in some ways more foundational, problem: the loss of Florida's own native apex predator. For 6 years, the reintroduction program operated on faith. Biologists released captive-bred snakes, tracked what they could with radio telemetry and trail cameras at gopher tortoise burrows, and waited to see whether a species absent from the region for over 40 years could actually reestablish itself. In the fall of 2023, they got their answer. Trail cameras of the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve captured 2 untagged Eastern Indigo Snake hatchlings, animals that had not been bred in captivity, meaning they were the offspring of previously released snakes, born and hatched entirely in the wild. Michelle Hoffman, the biologist with the Orianne Center, who has led much of the on-the-ground monitoring, has described it as confirmation that the years of restoration work were finally paying off, a sign the population wasn't just surviving on released individuals, but beginning to reproduce and sustain itself. The program has continued to expand every year since. In spring 2025, partners released 42 more captive-raised snakes at the preserve, the largest single release in the program's history, bringing the cumulative total at that one site past 200 animals. Winter and spring monitoring surveys at year turned up a female originally released back in 2019 still alive and active, alongside 19 other snakes released between 2020 and 2024, plus a robust 6-foot male moving confidently through restored habitat. By 2026, the program marked its 9th consecutive year of releases, with organizers noting that between the Florida site and a parallel reintroduction effort in Alabama's Conecuh National Forest, close to 500 Eastern Indigo snakes have now been returned to the wild across both states. None of this means the indigo snake is single-handedly solving Florida's python crisis. Even the biologists running the program are careful not to overstate it. A snake that tops out around 9 feet is not going to hunt down adult pythons that can exceed 15 feet and outweigh it many times over. What the science does show is more modest but still meaningful. Indigo snakes prey opportunistically on juvenile pythons and python eggs, compete with pythons for some of the same food resources, and more importantly, restore a native apex predator to a landscape that had been missing one for nearly half a century. Restoring balance to an ecosystem rarely comes down to a single decisive fix. It comes down to rebuilding pieces of the system until it can start regulating itself again. And a native apex predator is one of the most important pieces to put back. While the Indigo program was quietly proving itself in the Panhandle, something unexpected was also happening further south, in Python territory itself. In December 2022, researchers with Conservancy of Southwest Florida were tracking a radio-collared male python nicknamed Loki, a 13-foot, 52-pound scout snake used to locate breeding females, when they found his body near Naples. His head and neck had been chewed off and buried beneath a layer of pine needles, a caching behavior typical of a wildcat. Biologist David Schindel of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service set a trail camera near the site, and the following morning it captured the animal responsible. Not a Florida panther, but a 25-pound bobcat, returned to feed on a python roughly twice its own body weight. It was, according to the Conservancy, the first documented case of a bobcat killing an adult Burmese python in Florida. Researchers suspect a cold snap had left the cold-blooded Loki sluggish and unable to defend himself far from the warmth of his burrow. But the kills still mattered. Bartoszek, who has necropsied pythons and found bobcat claws inside their stomachs, called it a win for the home team. His team has since documented other native predators beginning to take on pythons, alligators preying on small individuals, bird of prey, and other snakes targeting hatchlings, and even the endangered Florida panther occasionally taking a python as prey. None of this reverses 2 decades of damage overnight. A single bobcat kill doesn't undo a population crash measured in the tens of thousands, and researchers are careful to describe these events as encouraging signs rather than a turning point. But taken together with the indigo snake's return, they point toward the same conclusion. Florida's native wildlife isn't simply the passive victim of this invasion anymore. Some of it is starting to adapt, learn, and push back, slowly, unevenly, but measurably. The joke about Florida releasing snakes to fight snakes was always missing the real story. Nobody released Eastern Indigo Snakes as a desperate, last-minute gimmick to beat the pythons. Conservationists spent nearly a decade rebuilding the exact habitat this animal needs, breeding it in captivity, and reintroducing it piece by piece into a landscape it had been driven out of long before a single python ever reached Florida. The overlap of the python crisis is real and it's useful, but the deeper story is about a state quietly repairing damage it caused its own ecosystem generations ago, and getting, for the first time in decades, wild-born proof that the repair is working. Florida still has an enormous python problem, and there's no evidence it will ever be fully solved. But somewhere in the Panhandle, a snake that almost vanished from the map is gliding into a gopher tortoise burrow it hasn't used in 40 years, hunting the way it always has, and raising the next generation on its own. That's not a punchline. That's what a slow, patient conservation win actually looks like. Sources referenced: U.S. Geological Survey Python Research, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Conservancy of Southwest Florida, Ian Bartoszek, the Nature Conservancy in Florida, Central Florida Zoo and Botanical Gardens, Orianne Center for Indigo Conservation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Eastern Indigo Snake Recovery Program, South Florida Water Management District, reporting from Smithsonian Magazine Live Science, and Outdoor Life on Everglades predator-prey dynamics.